I used to think the past was something you could leave behind. Just pack your bags, change your address, maybe dye your hair if you're feeling dramatic. The past was history, filed away in dusty boxes or faded photographs you'd occasionally stumble across while cleaning out drawers. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. Some things from the past don't stay buried. They wait, they watch. And sometimes they call you home to a place you've never been before. My name is Marcus, and 3 months ago I inherited property from a great-aunt I didn't even know existed. Marcus Chen, apparently my grandmother's sister, had lived alone for 60 years in some small town I'd never heard of. When the lawyer called, I figured it was just another family mystery. My family was good at keeping secrets, at pretending certain people had never existed. The inheritance seemed straightforward enough. A piece of land, some old buildings, nothing spectacular. I'm a freelance photographer, always looking for interesting locations, so I thought maybe I could turn it into something artistic. Urban decay photography was having a moment, and abandoned buildings always told the best stories. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why Agnes had left the property to me specifically when we'd never met. I should have questioned why the real estate agent's hands shook when she handed me the keys, but I didn't. I loaded up my camera gear, drove 6 hours to the middle of nowhere, and stepped into a nightmare I'm still trying to wake up from. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. The kind that makes you whisper without knowing why. The property sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by pine trees that seemed to lean inward, like they were trying to hide something. The main building was massive, 3 stories of red brick and broken dreams. Gothic revival architecture, with tall windows that looked like eyes, and a bell tower that reached toward the sky like a finger pointing at God, asking questions that probably shouldn't be answered. I took pictures first, because that's what I do. That's how I process the world, through a lens that keeps things at a safe distance. But when I looked at the images later, I noticed things I hadn't seen with my naked eye. Faces in windows, shadows that didn't match the objects casting them. And in one photo, clear as day, a small handprint on the glass of a second-story window that should have been my first clue that this place knew I was coming. I still live here. I can't seem to leave. I just don't go to certain rooms anymore. And at night, when the wind picks up, I swear I can hear children singing lullabies that were old when my grandmother was young. The same lullabies she used to hum when she thought no one was listening. Hey, I'm Marcus. Welcome to the Creepy Journal, where horror starts like memory and ends like truth. If you're here for the first time, you found the right place for stories that blur the line between what happened and what we wish had never happened. Subscribe before the building starts, remembering you too. Trust me, you don't want it to get that personal. The meeting with Eleanor Whitmore, the real estate agent, should have been my second warning. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back so tight it stretched the wrinkles around her eyes. Professional enough, but there was something in the way she avoided looking directly at me, like she was afraid of what she might see. We met at a diner in town, one of those places where the coffee tastes like it was brewed sometime in the last century and everyone stops talking when a stranger walks in. Eleanor had spread out the paperwork across a booth that smelled like vanilla air freshener, trying to cover up cigarette smoke. Your grantant was a private woman, she said, sliding the deed across the table. Lived alone, kept to herself. The property's been in your family for generations. though I don't think Agnes ever actually lived in the main building. I looked at the deed, 23 acres, including what was listed as a residential structure and several outbuildings. Nothing about an orphanage, nothing about the massive institution I'd already seen dominating the landscape. What exactly is the main building? I asked, pointing to the vague description. From the road, it looks like some kind of institution. Eleanor's pen stopped moving. She looked up at me for the first time since we'd sat down, and I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach drop. Fear, maybe, or guilt. It's been empty for decades, she said finally. Used to be St. Catherine's Orphanage, back when the state ran those kinds of facilities. Closed in 1987. Nothing's been done with it since. Why isn't it mentioned in the paperwork? She gathered the documents quickly, avoiding my eyes again. Legal complications. The orphanage wasn't technically part of the original property. It was built later, some kind of arrangement with the county. Your aunt inherited the land, not the building itself, but since it's been abandoned so long, she shrugged. Paperwork gets complicated with old properties. That should have been a bigger red flag than it was. Properties don't just exist in legal limbo. Buildings don't get forgotten by the bureaucracy that created them. But I was thinking like a photographer, not a detective. I was thinking about angles and lighting, about the stories those empty windows might tell. Eleanor handed me 3 keys. 2 were modern, brass-colored and clean. The third was old iron, heavy in my hand, with an ornate head that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel. The new keys are for the gate and the smaller buildings, she said. The old one, well, that's been with the property since your aunt first inherited it. She never told me what it opened. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded to know why a real estate agent was handling property she clearly knew more about than she was saying. I should have asked why her hands were shaking when she gave me that iron key. Instead, I signed the papers, shook her thin hand, and walked out of that diner carrying the deed to a property that apparently came with a massive building full of secrets that no one wanted to talk about. The drive back to the property took 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The trees seemed denser, the sky grayer, and when I pulled up to the main building again, I could swear more windows were broken than when I'd left. I stood there with those 3 keys in my hand, looking up at St. Catherine's Orphanage, and for the first time, I felt like something was looking back. I set up camp in what used to be the orphanage's administrative wing. It seemed like the safest choice, separate from the dormitories and common areas where the children would have lived. The rooms were smaller, more manageable, and most importantly, they had fewer windows to board up before dark. The first night, I convinced myself the noises were just old building settling. Every structure makes sounds, especially ones that have been empty for 35 years. Pipes contract, floorboards shift, mice scurry through walls. All perfectly normal explanations for the soft tapping that seemed to follow me from room to room. I'd brought basic camping gear, nothing fancy. Sleeping bag, portable stove, battery-powered lantern. I figured I'd rough it for a few days while I assessed what could be salvaged and what needed to be torn down. The electricity had been shut off decades ago, and the water lines had been drained to prevent freezing. But around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up in my sleeping bag and listen with every nerve in my body on high alert. Tapping 3, short, 2 long, 3 short again. SOS in Morse code. It was coming from inside the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, but it stayed just ahead of me, moving from room to room like it was leading me somewhere. When I'd get close to the source, it would stop, then start up again from the opposite direction, like a game of hide and seek that I wasn't winning. The second night was worse. The tapping was joined by a cold breeze that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I'd sealed the windows as best I could with plastic sheeting and duct tape, but somehow air was moving through the building like it was alive and breathing. I'd be sitting at my makeshift desk, uploading photos to my laptop, and suddenly feel this cold air on the back of my neck. When I'd turn around, nothing. When I'd go back to my work, there it was again, like frozen fingers trailing across my skin. The third night, the lights started. I don't mean electric lights. There was no power to the building. I mean small points of light that would flicker. In my peripheral vision, gone the moment I turned to look directly at them. Firefly lights, but it was late October, and fireflies don't live indoors. They appeared mostly in the hallways, dancing along the walls like memories of illumination. Sometimes I'd catch one long enough to see it clearly, just a soft, warm glow about the size of a marble floating 3 or 4 feet off the ground, the height a child might carry a candle. By the fourth night, I was starting to document everything. Photographer's instinct, I guess. If something strange was happening, I needed proof. I set up cameras with night vision capabilities, positioned them to cover the main hallways and the rooms where the disturbances seemed strongest. That's when I noticed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the building. The layout was wrong. I'd been mapping the orphanage as I explored, sketching out the floor plan for my own reference. But when I compared my drawings to what I was seeing in the camera feeds, rooms appeared to be in different places. Doorways opened onto walls that should have had windows. Hallways that should have connected instead led to dead ends. At first, I thought I was just disoriented. Old buildings can be confusing, especially at night when shadows play tricks on your eyes. But I'm good with spatial relationships. It's part of being a photographer, and I was certain that the door at the end of the East Wing corridor had opened into a supply closet yesterday. Tonight, it opened into a room I'd never seen before, a room that shouldn't exist. The door had no business being there, according to the building's original blueprints, which I'd found in a filing cabinet in what used to be the main office. The East Wing ended in a supply closet barely larger than a phone booth, but when I turned the handle, and I still don't know what made me try it, since every other door in the building was either unlocked or broken, it swung open onto something impossible. The room was pristine, not just clean, but untouched by the decay that had claimed every other part of the orphanage. The wallpaper was intact, a pattern of small roses on cream-colored background. The hardwood floor gleamed like it had been polished yesterday. There was even a window, tall and narrow, with clean glass and white curtains that moved gently in a breeze that had no source. According to the blueprints, there was no window on that wall. It was an interior wall, backed up against another room. I stood in the doorway for a long time, afraid to step inside. The room felt like a trap, like something waiting to spring shut the moment I crossed the threshold. But it was also beautiful in a way that the rest of the building wasn't. It looked lived in, cared for, loved. There was a small bed against one wall, perfectly made with a quilt that looked handmade. A rocking chair sat by the window, positioned to catch the light, and on a small dresser, a collection of items that made my blood run cold. A hairbrush with dark hair still tangled in the bristles, a glass of water that hadn't evaporated, and a photograph of a man I recognized. My grandfather. dead for 15 years. But there he was, in a silver frame, looking exactly as I remembered him from my childhood, young and smiling, wearing a suit I'd seen him wear to church. I finally stepped into the room, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath misted in front of my face as I approached the dresser, reaching for the photograph with a hand that shook worse than Eleanor Whitmore's. The picture was real, not a copy or a reproduction. I could tell by the way the paper felt between my fingers, slightly rough with age. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, someone had written, "David Chen, 1962. My grandfather would have been 22, just starting college. How had his photograph ended up in a room that didn't exist? In an orphanage he'd never mentioned, on property owned by a great-aunt I'd never heard of. I spent an hour in that room, documenting everything with my camera. The quilt, the rocking chair, the impossible window that looked out onto a garden that couldn't be there because the other side of that wall was another building. I took dozens of photos, afraid that if I blinked, the whole thing would disappear. When I finally left the room and closed the door behind me, I marked it clearly in my notebook. East wing, end of corridor, impossible room with grandfathers. Photographed the next morning, I went back to check on it. The door opened onto a supply closet. Small, cramped, full of moldy cleaning supplies and broken mops. No window, no bed, no photograph. Just 4 walls, a ceiling, and the smell of industrial disinfectant gone sour with age. I checked my photographs. Every image from the pristine room had turned out dark, like I'd forgotten to remove the lens cap. But I knew I hadn't. I'd been careful, deliberate, professional. That night, I tried again. The door opened onto the impossible room, exactly as I'd found it before. But this time, things had been moved. The rocking chair was closer to the window. The quilt was folded differently. And on the dresser, next to my grandfather's photograph, there was a new picture. This one was of me as a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting on a swing I didn't remember, wearing clothes I didn't recognize, smiling at a camera I had no memory of facing. On the back, in the same handwriting, Marcus Chen, 1996, the year I turned 7, the year my family stopped talking about certain relatives, stopped mentioning names that used to come up at holiday dinners, the year my grandmother started humming those lullabies when she thought no one was listening. I was starting to understand that this place knew things about me that I didn't know about myself. And every night, that impossible room was going to show me more. By the end of my first week at St. Catherine's, I'd established a routine of sorts. Days for exploration and documentation, nights for experiencing whatever the building wanted to show me. The impossible room became my focal point, the center of mysteries that seemed to spiral out from it like ripples in dark water. It was during a daytime exploration of the room above the impossible room that I found the crawl space. I'd been trying to understand the building's architecture, to figure out how a room could exist in a space that should have been occupied by something else. The ceiling in the room directly above had water damage, and when I pressed against a discolored section, a panel gave way, revealing a narrow opening barely large enough for an adult to squeeze through. The crawl space was different from the rest of the building. While everything else showed decades of neglect, this hidden area seemed deliberately maintained. The wooden planks were solid, free of rot or insect damage. The air smelled clean, almost sterile, like a hospital corridor. I crawled forward with my flashlight, following a path that seemed to have been worn smooth by regular use. After 20 feet, the space opened up into what could only be described as a hidden room, tall enough for me to stand upright. And that's where I found the mirror. It was an antique, full length, with an ornate silver frame that reflected my flashlight beam back in scattered patterns. But what made me stop breathing was what the mirror was facing. A door that couldn't possibly exist. According to my measurements, that door should have opened onto empty air 3 stories above the ground. But there it was, solid wood with brass. Hardware, looking like it led somewhere instead of nowhere. The mirror itself seemed wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. My reflection looked accurate enough, but there was a quality to it that made me uncomfortable, like looking at yourself in old photographs, recognizing your face but not quite remembering being the person who had posed for the picture. Next to the mirror stood a dollhouse. It was a perfect replica of St. Catherine's Orphanage, complete in every detail down to the Gothic windows and bell tower. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, museum quality, with tiny furniture and fixtures that moved when you touched them. Even the impossible room was there, a perfect miniature with a bed. You could cover with a quilt the size of a postage stamp, but pieces were missing. Small figures that should have represented the orphanage's residents had been removed, leaving empty spaces in the tiny rooms. On closer inspection, I realized the missing figures weren't random. They'd been taken from specific locations: the dormitories, the dining hall, the chapel, all the places where children would have gathered. At the base of the dollhouse, I found a small wooden box containing the missing figures. They were carved with incredible detail, each one unique. Children of different ages, wearing period clothing from what looked like the 1960s and 70s. Their faces were painted with an attention to realism that was almost unsettling. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a figure that made my hands shake. A tiny carved representation of me as a child, wearing the same clothes I'd seen in the photograph that had appeared in the impossible room. The figure was so accurate it could have been carved from life, capturing details I wouldn't have expected anyone to notice. A small scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. The way my hair always stuck up in the back no matter how much my mother tried to smooth it down. Someone had been watching me when I was 6 years old. Someone had cared enough to create this perfect miniature, to place it in a dollhouse hidden in the walls of an orphanage I'd never heard of. I carefully placed the figure back in the tissue paper and closed the box. But as I turned to leave the hidden room, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror again. And this time, I noticed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reflections and reality. The mirror showed me holding the wooden box, but it also showed someone else in the room behind me, someone small enough to be a child, reaching toward the impossible door with one tiny hand. When I spun around, the space was empty, but the door that shouldn't exist, that couldn't lead anywhere, was standing slightly open, and through the crack, I could hear something that made every instinct I had scream at me to run. The sound of children playing, laughing, calling to each other in voices that seemed to come from a time when St. Catherine's was alive with the sounds of daily life. The ventilation system at St. Catherine's was a relic from the 1940s. A network of metal ducts and registers that connected every room in the building like arteries carrying breath instead of blood. During the day, I'd hear normal sounds through the vents, settling metal, mice scratching, the occasional bird that had found its way inside. At night, the vents carried voices. It started as breathing, so soft I thought it might be wind moving through the system. But wind doesn't pause, doesn't catch itself like someone trying not to cry. And wind doesn't whisper words in a voice so young it breaks your heart to hear it. Don't go. The first time I heard it clearly, I was in the administrative wing, uploading the day's photographs to my laptop. The voice came from the register near the ceiling, barely more than a whisper, but distinct enough that I stopped what I was doing and listened. Don't go up there. He doesn't like it when people go up there. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed onto a chair to peer into the vent. Nothing but darkness and the smell of dust and old metal. But when I climbed down and returned to my work, the voice came again, this time from a different register across the room. He's angry now. You shouldn't have taken the box. The box, the collection of carved figures I'd found in the hidden room above the impossible room. I'd left it up there, exactly where I'd found it. But somehow this child's voice knew I'd opened it, knew I'd seen what was inside. Over the next few nights, the voice became my constant companion. Always different registers, always moving through. The building, like the child, was crawling through the ductwork, following me from room to room. Sometimes she'd give warnings. The stairs creak on the third step. Don't use the flashlight near the windows. He can see light from outside. Other times, she'd share information that felt more like memories. Sister Margaret used to count us every night before bed. 1, 2, 3. But the numbers never came out right. Dr. Marsh had cold hands. We didn't like it when she came to visit. Some of us never got adopted. Some of us never left. I started talking back, asking questions that usually went unanswered, but occasionally she'd respond with something that chilled me to my bones. What's your name? I asked one night, speaking to the ceiling of what used to be the main dormitory. Sarah, came the whisper from a register near the floor. But that wasn't always my name. None of our names were always our names. What do you mean? A long pause. Then they changed our names when we got here. Said it would help us fit in better with new families. But some names don't stick. Some names remember where they came from. Sarah, why are you still here? Why haven't you moved on? Another pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, her voice was fainter, like she was moving away from the register. We're waiting for someone who belongs to us, someone who was supposed to come home a long time ago. Who are you waiting for? But that night, she didn't answer. The vents fell silent, except for the normal sounds of settling metal and scratching mice. I waited for hours, calling her name softly, but Sarah's voice had disappeared into whatever darkness lived inside the walls of St. Catherine's. The next night, she returned with information that made me understand why Eleanor Whitmore had been so nervous, why the paperwork had been so vague, why my Aunt Agnes had never actually lived in the main building. The man who lived in the little house, Sarah whispered from the register above my sleeping bag. He used to watch us through the windows. He took pictures of us playing. He kept a book with all our names written down, all our real names, the ones from before. What man, Sarah? The man who looked like you. The man who had your eyes and your smile and your grandfather's hands. The man who promised to take care of us but never took anyone home. I sat up in my sleeping bag, flashlight beam dancing across the ceiling as my hands shook. Sarah, what was his name? David, she whispered, her voice growing fainter as if she was moving deeper into the ventilation system. His name was David Chen, and he's been waiting for you almost as long as we have. The next morning, I needed air that didn't smell like dust and old secrets. I needed space that wasn't confined by walls that seemed to listen to every word I spoke. So I loaded up my camera gear and drove into town, looking for answers to questions. I was afraid to ask. The town of Millbrook existed in that liminal space between functional and forgotten. Main Street had the basics: a post office, a diner, a hardware store, but half the storefronts were empty, their windows papered over, with faded for rent signs that looked like they'd been there for years. It was the kind of place that might have been thriving once, when St. Catherine's was operational and brought visitors and employees and economic activity to the area. I parked in front of Briggs Hardware and spent 20 minutes pretending to shop for supplies while working up the nerve to ask about the orphanage. Tommy Briggs, the owner, was probably in his 60s, with the kind of practical hands that came from a lifetime of fixing things that were broken. "You're the photographer," he said, not really a question. "Staying out at the old place." Word traveled fast in small towns. "Agnes Chen's great-nephew," I confirmed. "I'm documenting the property, trying to decide what to do with it." Tommy nodded, rang up the flashlight batteries and duct tape I didn't really need. "Your aunt was a good woman. Quiet, kept to herself, but she looked after that place better than most would have. She lived there for 60 years, in the caretaker's cottage, yeah. Never set foot in the main building, far as I know. Can't say I blame her," he handed me my change, studying my face with the directness that small-town people had perfected. "You look like him, you know. Like David. Same eyes, same way of holding your shoulders." My stomach dropped. "You knew my grandfather, knew of him. He worked at St. Catherine's back in the day, before it closed. Used to come into town for supplies. Always paid in cash, always polite. But there were stories." Tommy trailed off, like he was deciding how much to say to someone who might not want to hear it. "What kind of stories?" He glanced around the empty store, then leaned across the counter. "Look, I don't know what kind of man your grandfather was outside of those walls, but inside St. Catherine's, people said he was too interested in those kids, too involved in decisions that weren't his to make." The floor felt unsteady beneath my feet. "What do you mean, too involved?" "The adoption process. Records keeping. He had access to information he shouldn't have had, made recommendations about which children went to which families. Some folks said he was taking money under the table, steering the best placements toward whoever paid the most." I thought about Sarah's voice in the vents. "He promised to take care of us, but never took anyone home." "But there were other stories too," Tommy continued, his voice dropping lower. "Stories about children who disappeared from the records entirely. Kids who were there one day and gone the next, like they'd never existed at all. The official story was always the same: private adoption, confidential placement, case closed. But some of the staff thought something else was happening." "Like what?" Tommy straightened up, the moment of openness closing like a door. "Like I said, just stories. Old gossip from people who probably had their own reasons for spreading rumors. But if I were you, I'd be careful out there. That place has a long memory, and not all of it is pleasant." I drove back to St. Catherine's with my head spinning. The afternoon sun was filtering through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the orphanage grounds, and, for the first time, I really looked at the smaller buildings scattered around. The main structure, the caretaker's cottage where Agnes had lived, a maintenance shed that still held tools from the 1980s, and tucked back among the trees, almost hidden by overgrowth, a small building I'd somehow missed during my initial survey of the property. It was a single-story structure, built from the same red brick as the orphanage, but clearly added later. The windows were boarded up from the inside, and the door was secured with a padlock that looked newer than everything else on the property. I found a crowbar in the maintenance shed and broke the lock. Inside, the building was set up like an office. File cabinets lined 3 walls, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. Everything was covered in dust, but underneath the grime, I could see that someone had left in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the desk, drawers had been pulled out and emptied hastily, and in one corner, a filing cabinet had been overturned entirely. But they hadn't gotten everything in the back of the bottom drawer of the desk. I found a manila folder marked Chen D personnel file. Inside were documents that made my hand shake as I read them. Employment records, performance evaluations, and correspondence that painted a picture of my grandfather I'd never seen before. David Chen, hired in 1961 as an administrative assistant. Promoted to records coordinator in 1963. Placed on administrative leave in 1967. Pending investigation into irregularities in adoption documentation. Terminated in 1968 for conduct unbecoming to the institution's mission. But the most damaging document was a letter from Father Hartwell to the county supervisor. Dated March 15, 1968, Mr. Chun's access to confidential records has resulted in serious breaches of protocol. Multiple instances of falsified documentation have been discovered, including adoption papers that appear to have been altered after the fact. Of greater concern are the discrepancies in our census records. We currently show 47 children in residence, but physical count reveals only 43. Mr. Chen claims the missing children were placed in emergency adoptions, but no corresponding paperwork exists. I recommend immediate termination and a full investigation. At the bottom of the file was a handwritten note. Investigation suspended due to lack of cooperation from key witnesses. Case closed administratively. D. Chen banned from all county facilities. I sat in that dusty office as the sun set outside, reading and rereading documents that transformed my grandfather from the gentleman I remembered into someone I didn't recognize. Someone who had worked at St. Catherine's during the exact period when children had gone missing from the records. Someone who had taken photographs of the orphans and kept detailed notes about their backgrounds. Someone who, according to a voice in the vents, had looked exactly like me. The personnel file was just the beginning. Once I knew what to look for, I found more hidden documents throughout the property. Agnes had apparently been collecting information about St. Catherine's for decades, gathering evidence like she was, building a case that would never go to trial. In the caretaker's cottage, behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, I discovered 3 boxes of materials dating from the orphanage's entire operational period. Journals, letters, medical records, and photographs that painted a picture of institutional dysfunction that went far deeper than my grandfather's involvement. The earliest documents were from Father Hartwell himself, journals he'd kept during his tenure at St. Catherine's. His handwriting was precise, controlled, but the content revealed a man struggling with forces he didn't understand. March 3, 1962, the adoption inquiries continue to increase, but I'm troubled by the nature of some requests. Wealthy families specifically asking for children with no living relatives, no possibility of family reconnection. They offer substantial donations to the orphanage, but their interest seems less focused on providing homes than on acquiring children who can disappear completely from public record. Juni 15, 1964. David Chun has proven invaluable in managing our administrative burden, but I'm concerned about his methods. He's developed relationships with adoption agencies that operate outside normal channels. When I question the legitimacy of certain placements, he assures me that confidentiality is paramount, that some adoptive families require absolute privacy for their protection. September 22nd, 1965. 3 more children have been placed through David's private channels. When I asked to review the adoption paperwork, he claimed the files were sealed by court order. I'm beginning to suspect that some of these adoptions are not what they appear to be. The children seem frightened before they leave, and several have tried to hide when their new families come to collect them. December 8th, 1966. I confronted David about the missing census records. He became defensive, claiming that accurate record keeping was impossible with so many emergency placements. But I've spoken with other institutions in the county, and none report the volume of urgent adoptions that we seem to facilitate. Something is fundamentally wrong with our system. April 18th, 1967. Dr. Helena Marsh visited today for her monthly medical evaluations. She spent considerable time with David, reviewing files in his office. When I asked about her assessment, she claimed the children were all healthy, but several staff members reported seeing her collect blood samples from specific children, always the ones scheduled for David's special placements. I'm requesting a full review of our medical protocols. The final entry in Father Hartwell's journal was dated August 30th, 1967, just months before my grandfather's termination. I can no longer ignore what's happening here. Children are disappearing, not into loving homes, but into something darker. David has connections I don't understand, payments that don't appear in our official books, and access to information about these children's backgrounds that he shouldn't possess. The bloodline research troubles me most of all. Why does it matter where these children came from? Why does someone need to know their genetic history before adopting them? I fear we've become something other than a place of sanctuary. But it was Dr. Helena Marsh's correspondence that revealed the true horror of what had been happening at St. Catherine's. Her letters to an unnamed recipient, found in a separate file, read like reports from a scientific experiment. October 12, 1965. The Chen subject continues to show excellent results. His genetic mapping has identified 17 potential candidates among the current residents. Blood work confirms the markers we discussed. I recommend proceeding with the next phase of collection. February 3rd, 1966. The family lineage research proves invaluable. Children with specific ancestral connections respond better to the conditioning protocols. David's access to genealogical records allows us to identify subjects before they're even aware of their heritage. The orphans who show the strongest responses invariably have family connections to the property itself. July 19th, 1967. Today's subject displayed remarkable sensitivity to the environmental triggers during the basement evaluation. She correctly identified locations of historical significance without any prior knowledge of the building's history. Her genealogical markers suggest a direct connection to the original landowners. I believe we've found an ideal candidate for the permanent collection. August 15th, 1967. David reports that the Chen boy shows exceptional promise. Despite his young age, he demonstrates the same genetic markers that made his grandfather such a valuable subject. I recommend moving him to the Special Observation Wing until we can arrange for proper collection. His family believes he's been adopted, so there will be no inquiries about his whereabouts. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. The Chen boy, my grandfather, hadn't been a corrupt employee skimming money from adoptions. He'd been a victim. And apparently, so had I. The final document in Dr. Marsh's file was a letter dated September 10th, 1967. The experiment must be suspended immediately. Father Hardwell's investigation threatens exposure of the entire program. I'm destroying all clinical records and relocating the permanent collection to secure facilities. David Chen will be terminated and discredited to prevent him from revealing what he's witnessed. The property will remain monitored through Marcus Chen, who has proven reliable in maintaining security around the site. When the genetic conditions are favorable again, we'll resume collection operations. But there was one more document, this one in my grandfather's handwriting, hidden inside a Bible I found in the cottage. They took my son. They told Mary he'd been adopted by a family in California, gave her fake papers and a story about confidential placement. But I know what really happened. I've seen the basement rooms, the medical equipment, the children who never leave. Thomas is down there somewhere, part of their collection, part of whatever they're trying to preserve or create or summon. I can't get him out alone. I can't make anyone believe me. But someday, someone from our family will come back to this place. Someone with the same blood, the same markers they were looking for. And maybe that person will be strong enough to finish what I couldn't. Thomas. My grandfather had a son named Thomas who had disappeared into St. Catherine's underground. A son who would have been my father's older brother, making him my uncle. An uncle I'd never heard of because his disappearance had been covered up so thoroughly that even his existence had been erased from family memory. But according to Sarah's voice in the vents, some names don't stick. Some names remember where they came from. And in the impossible room that changed every night, someone had been waiting for a Chen family member to come home and find the truth that had been buried for over 50 years. The night after I found the documents, St. Catherine's stopped pretending to be just an abandoned building. Whatever had been waiting patiently for me to understand the truth decided it was time to make its presence undeniably known. I was in the administrative wing, transcribing Dr. Marsh's letters by laptop light, when every reflective surface in the room began to show something other than my reflection. The black computer screen showed a child's face, pale and thin, with eyes that tracked my movement as I tried to look away. The glass front of a picture frame reflected not the wall behind me, but a corridor I recognized from my exploration of the basement levels. And in that corridor, a figure in a white hospital gown was walking toward the camera, one hand reaching forward like he was trying to touch the glass from the other side. I slammed the laptop shut, plunging the room into darkness, but the reflections continued. In the window glass, in the chrome fixtures of an old lamp, in the polished surface of a doorknob. Everywhere I looked, I saw the same scene playing out. A child walking through basement corridors, getting closer to some invisible barrier, reaching out with increasing desperation when I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the basement. The stairs down were narrow and steep, and they'd clearly been added long after the orphanage was built. The walls were newer concrete instead of the original stone foundation, and the electrical work was more recent, probably installed in the 1960s when Dr. Marsh was conducting her evaluations. The basement level was larger than the building above, it extending beyond the orphanage's footprint into areas that should have been underground storage or utility space. But instead of finding mechanical systems or storage rooms, I discovered a complex of medical facilities that looked like they belonged in a research hospital, not a children's home. Examination rooms with operating tables, laboratory spaces with equipment I couldn't identify. And along one wall, a series of what could only be described as observation cells, small rooms, with reinforced glass windows and doors that locked from the outside. Most of the cells were empty, but in the furthest one from the entrance, something was moving. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam revealing a figure huddled in the corner. As I got closer, I could see it was a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, wearing a hospital gown that had once been white but was now stained with substances I didn't want to identify. When my light hit him, he looked up and I found myself staring into eyes that were unmistakably familiar. The same dark brown as mine, the same shape as my grandfather's, the same expression I'd seen in family photographs going back generations. Uncle Marcus, his voice was thin, confused, like he'd been sleeping for a very long time. Grandpa David said someone would come. He said family always comes back. I tried to speak, but no words would come. This was Thomas, my grandfather's lost son, looking exactly as he would have in 1967. He hadn't aged, hadn't grown, hadn't changed at all in the 56 years since he'd disappeared into Dr. Marsh's collection. "Are you here to take me home?" he asked, standing up and approaching the glass that separated us. "I've been waiting so long. The others have been waiting too." That's when I noticed them. In the shadows beyond my flashlight beam, other children were emerging from the darker recesses of the basement. Dozens of them, all wearing the same style hospital gowns, all looking exactly as they had when they'd been brought down here decades ago. "The blood remembers," said a girl who couldn't have been more than 6, her voice echoing strangely in the concrete space. That's what Dr. Marsh used to say. The blood remembers where it came from, and it calls its family home. "We've been keeping the place ready," added a boy with Thomas's eyes but different features. Grat and Agnes helped us. She brought us food and clothes and told us stories about the family members who lived in the world above. Agnes, my great-aunt, hadn't been a recluse living alone on the property. She'd been taking care of an underground colony of children who couldn't age, couldn't leave, couldn't die, but couldn't really live either. "What happened to you?" I whispered, finding my voice at last. Thomas pressed his small hands against the glass. "Dr. Marsh said we were special, said our blood had markers that made us valuable for preservation. She gave us injections that would keep us young and healthy forever, so we could be studied and protected and kept safe from the world that didn't understand how important we were. But the injections did something else too," continued the little girl. "They tied us to this place, made us part of its foundation. We can't leave the basement, can't go upstairs during the day, can't exist anywhere but here. Unless," Thomas said, looking directly at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, "someone with the same blood comes to take our place. Someone who can carry the preservation forward, keep the collection going for another generation." The temperature in the basement plummeted. My breath began to mist, and I could hear something that sounded like medical equipment starting up somewhere in the darkness beyond the cells. Machines that had been waiting decades for the right person to power them on. "Dr. Marsh said the experiment would continue," Thomas explained, his voice taking on a mechanical quality, like he was reciting a lesson he'd memorized long ago. "Said there would always be someone from the Chen family to maintain the collection, to add new specimens, to keep the bloodline research active. She said you'd come eventually," added the little girl. "Said the property would call you home when the time was right. Said you'd understand that some sacrifices are necessary for the advancement of human knowledge. Behind them, in the deepest shadows of the basement, I could see more equipment being wheeled forward by figures in white coats. Figures that moved with the same preserved stillness as the children, but were obviously much older, much more experienced. In the procedures they were preparing to begin. Dr. Helena Marsh stepped into the light, looking exactly as she had in 1967. Her cold hands now reaching for instruments that gleamed with surgical precision. "Welcome home, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the same clinical detachment I'd read in her letters. "We've been waiting for you to complete the family collection." I ran up the basement stairs, through the administrative wing, out into the cold October night, where normal air filled my lungs and normal sounds reached my ears. Behind me, I could hear them following, not footsteps, but something worse. The sound of preservation, of time being held artificially still, of decades of waiting finally coming to an end. I made it to my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, engine turning over just as the first pale figures emerged from the orphanage. Entrance. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in a line across the front steps. Dr. Marsh in her white coat, Thomas in his stained hospital gown, and dozens of other children whose lives had been stolen and stored in that underground collection. They didn't chase the car. They didn't need to. They knew I'd be back. I drove to the nearest motel, checked in under a false name, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I'd discovered. My family hadn't just had secrets, they'd had victims. Children who'd been experimented on, preserved, collected like specimens in a laboratory that operated under the guise of child welfare. And I wasn't just a random inheritor of property. I was the next generation of test subject, carefully tracked and guided back to St. Catherine's when the genetic conditions were right for expanding the collection. But as dawn broke, I realized something that Dr. Marsh and her preserved staff hadn't counted on. I wasn't the only one who knew the truth now. The documents I'd found, the photographs I'd taken, the evidence of what had happened at St. Catherine's. I could expose everything. I could bring authorities, investigators, people who wouldn't be swayed by supernatural preservation or genetic markers or bloodline research, except when I checked my camera equipment. Every photograph was blank. When I tried to access the documents on my laptop, the files were corrupted. And when I called the Millbrook Sheriff's Department to report illegal medical experiments, the deputy who answered the phone told me that St. Catherine's Orphanage had burned down in 1987, that nothing had been left standing, that there was no building on that property except for a small caretaker's cottage. I drove back to St. Catherine's that afternoon, expecting to find ruins, expecting to discover that everything I'd experienced had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Instead, I found the orphanage exactly as I'd left it. Solid, real, undeniably present, but the town records showed no building. The county assessor had no documentation of a structure on that property. Even Google Earth showed nothing but empty land and pine trees where I was standing, looking up at 3 stories of Gothic revival architecture. That's when I understood the final piece of what Dr. Marsh had accomplished. The preservation hadn't just affected the people in her collection, it had affected the building itself. The entire property, the very existence of St. Catherine's. She'd found a way to remove it from normal reality while keeping it perfectly intact for her purposes. The only people who could see it were the ones with the right genetic markers, the ones whose blood remembered where it came from. I wasn't the first person to inherit this property from Agnes. Over the decades, Other family members had been quietly guided back to St. Catherine's, and when they arrived, they'd found the same impossible room, heard the same voices in the vents, discovered the same terrible truth about what their family had been involved in. Some of them had joined the collection voluntarily. Others had tried to run, like I had, only to discover that certain knowledge can't be escaped. Once you know what happened in the basement of St. Catherine's, once you've seen the children who've been waiting for 56 years, once you understand that your bloodline was specifically selected for preservation, there's nowhere to go that feels safe, because every reflection shows you something you don't want to see. Every shadow might hide a figure in a hospital gown. Every child's voice you hear could be Sarah, calling from the vents of whatever building you're hiding in. I wasn't the first to come home to St. Catherine's, and I won't be the last. Thanks for listening to this confession. If you're still here, still paying attention after everything I've told you, then maybe you understand why I can't just pack up and leave. Maybe you understand why I'm sitting in the administrative wing of an orphanage that officially doesn't exist, typing this story on a laptop that shows blank screens to anyone else who looks at it. The preservation is patient. It's been waiting for decades, and it can wait a little longer. But every night, the impossible room shows me new photographs. Pictures of family members I've never met. Children who share my eyes and my grandfather's hands. People whose blood carries the same markers that make them valuable to Dr. Marsh's collection, and every night, I hear Sarah's voice in the vents, telling me about the others who are still out there, still unaware that St. Catherine's is calling them home. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe that's why this story found you, why you listened all the way to the end. Maybe somewhere in your family history, there's a connection to this place, a bloodline that remembers what it's supposed to forget. If you wake up tomorrow and find yourself thinking about abandoned buildings, if you start having dreams about children singing lullabies you've never heard before, if you feel an unexplained urge to research your genealogy or visit places your family never talked about, well, that might not be coincidence. Subscribe to The Creepy Journal for stories you wish weren't true. But more than that, subscribe because some stories are still being written, and some endings haven't been decided yet. The Chen family collection is still incomplete. Dr. Marsh is still conducting her research, and St. Catherine's Orphanage is still accepting new residents, whether they volunteer or not. Sweet dreams. And if you hear children singing in your walls tonight, remember what Sarah taught me. Some names don't stick, but some houses never forget where their family members have gone. I'm still here. I'm still documenting everything. And I'm still waiting for someone brave enough to help me figure out how to set the children free. But until then, the preservation continues. The collection grows, and St. Catherine's keeps calling its chosen ones home.